In this video, I want to talk about the grain deal. It's significant that this deal is now apparently dead, and it will be interesting to see what it will mean in practice. But to be honest, I think it's pretty bad news for the Russian Navy. As you can see, I'm not in the office these days. I'm spending some time in the countryside. It's not particularly good weather, so I hope it will stay dry while I do this. But I wanted to record a video with some reflections about the grain deal and what's going on there. Just to recap the history, the grain deal was signed last summer, so it's been there for about a year. It was signed on the 22nd of July of 2022, and it had a duration of 120 days. So it was a deal that would have to be renewed all the time to keep working. In the end of October, Russia announced that they were leaving the grain deal. But a few days after that, they changed their mind and they joined it again. And in November, then, the deal was extended by another 120 days. In March, then, it was extended by 60 days, and that happened again in May. So the agreement was up for renewal in mid-July. Back in November, when Russia had just left the grain deal and re-entered it, I made a video about it where I talked about how they were probably unhappy about how it was going. When they had signed the grain initiative originally, the Russian leaders still thought that they were going to win the war quickly. Like, Putin was still going around making jokes, basically making jokes of the idea that Ukraine was putting up a good fight, and he would be saying things like the only reason Russia hadn't won yet was that they were fighting with one hand behind their back. So having a deal that extended 120 days into the future, it seemed almost irrelevant for them. Ukraine was supposed to lose the war before those 120 days were over, so Russia might as well sign that deal and earn some goodwill on the world stage. But of course, it didn't work out that way, and instead, the grain deal became an advantage for Ukraine. So Russia was pretty tired of the grain deal already in October, but they had been kind of caught. They were not in a position where they could leave the grain deal again, and there were two reasons for that. The first one was that Russia did not want to get the blame for a food crisis in the developing world. They're trying to build relationships with these countries, so this would be counterproductive for them. So it was a trade-off for Russia, and in their eyes, it just turned out to be the lesser evil that Ukraine got to earn some money from exporting some grain than it would have been to damage their diplomatic efforts in Africa. And the other reason was that Russia is not militarily in a position where they can really enforce a blockade. They can bomb the Ukrainian port facilities, and they can also sink some cargo ships with torpedoes from submarines and things like that. But to do a real blockade, you need to be present with surface warships so that you can identify the ships in the area. You can conduct inspections and so forth. You can't just bomb whatever is there with torpedoes and long-range air-to-surface missiles. So you need sea control. Sea control is a term from naval warfare that means that you have enough control over the sea to use it for the things that you want to do. I have an old video about the concept of sea control if you're interested in that. But Russia does not have what it takes to have sea control in the northwestern part of the Black Sea right now. Ukraine has long-range, land-based anti-ship missiles, and they have also developed some quite sophisticated maritime drones. So if Russia moved their surface warfare, sort of warships forward to enforce a real blockade, then that's almost an open invitation for the Ukrainian Navy to sink them. So Russia's military options are pretty bad. The best they can do is probably to attack the harbors, and that's also what we've sort of been seeing over the last days that they have been doing. But they can't really control the ships as such, and this is where I think Russia is taking a risk. By leaving the grain initiative, things might actually get worse for Russia in the long run, because when they were in the grain deal, they had control over the maritime traffic in and out of Ukraine. Russia would get to inspect all the ships in Turkey, and Russia used that to make sure that they weren't carrying anything else but grain out of Ukraine. And then they also used those inspections to create a bottleneck, basically to slow down the grain exports, because they would just be ridiculously slow with these inspections, and the ships just had to wait there until there was a green signal. So what might happen now is that Russia can stop the grain exports for a while because they bombed the harbor facilities, but they might lose influence on the maritime traffic to Ukraine in the longer time frame. Like if it turns out that Russia can bomb the grain terminals, but they can't actually control the shipping, then that opens up a whole new perspective where Ukraine can start using maritime transportation for other things. And that also includes military logistics, because those things don't require grain terminals. So that's also why I thought Russia was going to renew the grain deal again. Like every time the deal has been up for renewal, Russia has made this ritual where they say that they're not going to sign it, and then they've done it anyways. And I thought that this was going to happen again because, as I see it, it was better for Russia to be in the grain deal than to have it fall to the ground. And I also think that was the Russian plan, actually. Like the grain deal was set to expire on July 17th, and a few days before that, the Turkish President Erdogan announced that he had talked with Putin, and that they agreed that the grain deal should be extended. So I thought this was pretty much following the plan. And if nothing else had happened, then I think the deal would have been extended. There would probably have been some kind of drama where the Russians said that they might not do it, but then they would have done it in the last minute like the other times. But then on the morning of the 17th of July, like on the same day that the grain deal was going to expire, then the Kerch Bridge was blown up. Like this is the bridge that goes to Crimea. It is hard to overstate how bad news this was for Russia. Like it creates serious bottlenecks for their military logistics. And it was also a personal humiliation for Putin. Like this bridge was his personal prestige project. And now Ukraine has blown it up twice over the last year. So later that day, of course, Russia announced that they would not extend the grain deal. Like it was pretty much impossible to imagine that they would sign an agreement with Ukraine about anything just after the Kerch Bridge was blown up. So Russia came up with a list of impossible demands that they wanted fulfilled before they would extend the deal. And that included lifting some sanctions from the West and stuff like that. And that's not going to happen, of course, because then in 60 or 120 days, Russia will just come up with more demands. So it looks like the grain deal is dead, at least unless Russia finds some way to climb down from the tree. But it's not really clear, actually, what that means in practice, that the deal is dead. In my view, it doesn't really look like Russia was ready for this step, so their messaging has been confusing. Like, first, the defense ministry said that all ships traveling to Ukraine would be considered to be potentially transporting military cargo. And that caused a lot of discussion because it sounded very aggressive. But if you look at the wording of it, then it's actually pretty vague. Like, what does it mean that they will consider all ships to be potential carriers of military cargo? Like, what are they going to do about it? Like, many people assumed that they were going to sink the ships or something like that, but that's not actually what they said. Like, it was just a vague statement with a kind of implied threat that it was up to the listener to make sense of. But as I've said before, you can't actually make a blockade by staying at a distance and firing missiles at everything. Like, first, there are rules about how you conduct a blockade, like from international law. Like, you have to make a formal announcement of the blockade so neutral states can warn their ships and those sorts of things. And then if there is a ship that you want to intercept, then you have to give a warning and you have to conduct an inspection. Like, you can't just shoot at it. But then if we assume that Russia is not going to follow international law and just shoot at everything anyways, then they run into a challenge with targeting. Like, they have to be in the area to know what to shoot at, like where the ships are. So the day after that vague statement from the Russian Ministry of Defense, another Russian official, this time it was from the Kremlin, clarified that Russia would inspect all ships heading for Ukrainian harbors. So this sounded more like a classical blockade, right? But it will be very dangerous for the Russian Navy to operate close to the Ukrainian coast, and there is a big risk that they're going to lose a ship if they do this. So it will be interesting to see what they will do. Like, I think for the time being, they're probably just going to keep on bombing the Ukrainian harbors, because that's a much easier problem for them to solve than to intercept the ships. And then they are hoping that this will be enough for the ship owners to stop sailing, so they won't have to enforce a real blockade. But in the bigger perspective, this has given Russia a range of dilemmas that it doesn't look like they had thought through when they canceled the grain deal. Like, honestly, it looks like a decision that was made in the heat of the moment when the Kerch Bridge was bombed, and Putin was probably angry, because Russia is now being blamed by everyone for using food as a weapon and hurting the developing countries. If they want to enforce a blockade, they will have to send warships into positions where they are vulnerable to Ukrainian attacks. But if they don't enforce that blockade, then it opens up the possibilities for Ukraine to start using maritime transportation at a broader scale than just for grain. And in the meantime, Russia is now spending their most valuable missiles on destroying piles of grain. And, like, from a Ukrainian perspective, that is much better than other things that Russia could be shooting at. And that, of course, leads to a question that I think is important, but where I obviously don't have the answers to this. Is just speculation. But given that in several ways the cancellation of the grain deal to me looks like a shot in the foot for Russia, I can't help wondering whether the timing of the attack on the Kerch Bridge maybe was not entirely coincidental. Like, is it possible that this was a trap for Putin and that he fell for it? Like, I don't know. But I do think the dynamics are now such that naval aspects of the war are back on the agenda. And I do think the trajectory sort of overall looks most favorable for Ukraine. The Russian Black Sea Fleet may, in practical terms, lose its relevance as a result of this over the coming time if it turns out that they're not able to enforce a blockade. So I must admit that I have been wondering whether somewhere in all this there is also a Ukrainian message to the West about the grain deal and the status of the Black Sea, that they're happy to keep exporting grain, but that they want more. Like, they want actual control over the access to their ports and not just to live off the mercy of Russian goodwill. Because from a Ukrainian perspective, the grain deal essentially means that Russia is getting a discount on a blockade. Like, they don't have to enforce a real blockade, but the world is sort of imposing a blockade on itself by only using Ukrainian ports for grain exports. And from a Ukrainian perspective, this is obviously not satisfying when they look at how weak the Russian Black Sea Fleet actually is. Like, it would be much better for them if the world helped them break this illusion of a Russian blockade. Okay, maybe I'm reading too much into the timing of the Kerch Bridge bombing, but I do find the timing puzzling. I mean, at least Ukraine must have thought about the possibility that this could be a consequence. And I do think that Russia has shot themselves in the foot with this decision to leave the grain deal, because in the big perspective, the grain deal was probably more beneficial for Russia and for the world community than it was for Ukraine. Okay, I will end it here. If you found this video useful, remember to give it a like. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you again next time.